Okay, and we are live, so almost live. Okay, good evening and welcome everyone. We are back again to continue Rabbi Silber's class on the Siddur. Those of you joining us here on Zoom, when I send you an invitation to become a panelist, we encourage that you please do accept it. It lets you into the room, so to speak, so that you can share your camera if you are so inclined, and you will also be able to mute and unmute yourself more easily during times for discussion, questions, and answers. But we do ask that if you are not meaning to speak, do stay muted when Rabbi Silber is lecturing, just to cut down on background noise. If you would like to share questions or comments in the chat, you are of course welcome to do so too. Those joining us on Facebook Live, good evening. You are welcome to put questions and comments in the comment section right below the video. And if you're joining us on Drisha Live, hello, good evening. We're glad that you're here learning with us. We will be working in the Siddur, and of course, it's always good to have a Tanakh on hand. I will do my best to keep the text that we're working on up to date on screen, so you have them there for your convenience. But of course, if you have a physical book that you prefer, you are at your leisure to use that instead. Rabbi Silber, please.
Okay, all right. So we had one or two more pieces of the very first blessing of the Amidah, and we just had started. And this was raised by several people. In terms of the language of the first blessing. And what we noticed was that the first blessing, apart from the Gadol, Gibor, V'Norah, which we spoke some length, there are also three other terms that appear in the first blessing very prominently, and they are El Elyon, the high God. We have Konei HaKol, either the possessor of or the creator of all. Konei, it's a question if Konei refers to possession or refers to creation. And finally, the blessing of the first bracha is Magen Avraham. So those three terms, Magen Avraham, El Elyon, and we have the text in our Amidah, Konei HaKol, the possessor of everything. And I pointed out that on the Friday night repetition of the Amidah Friday night. Usually at night there's no repetition, but Friday night there's a short repetition of the Amidah, and there those three terms come together, right, one after the next. El Elyon, Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, Magen Avot. So over there the language is Magen Avot, which is actually the Talmud Yerushalmi's blessing instead of Magen Avraham. But there we also have the three terms that come together. We have El Elyon, Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. We have Konei HaKol. They have Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, which is Yerushalmi is Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. And finally, Magen Avot, we have Magen Avraham. And these three terms happen to come together in one place in the Torah. And that is the story of the book of Breshit, chapter 14, and the story of the war of the 5 kings against the 4 kings. And in that war, which is the subject of chapter 14, so the 4 kings, 4 powerful kings, 4 great kings of the world, that's how the chapter begins, came to pass in the time of, and it mentions these 4 kings, the king of Babylon, the king of Goyim, etc., the king of Elam. These are big kingdoms. And it says they had a war against 5 little kings. King of Sodom. When you read the story, actually, in the beginning of chapter 14, it's very interesting that when you actually read the story, it begins by telling us there was a great battle of the 5 kings against the 4. But actually, when you read from the beginning of the chapter, in terms of a description of how this war happened, it becomes clear, at least in my eyes, becomes quite clear, that the 5 kings, we are told, rebelled against the 4. That's found in verse number 3, verse number 4. They served Kedar Laomer as one of the 4 kings. They rebelled in the 13th year. In the 14th year, Kedar Laomer and the kings that were with him, the other 3, came. And there is a description beginning in verse number 5 of the nations, the peoples that these four kings defeated. And what's very striking is two things. First of all, it doesn't mention the five kings at all. Five kings come later. But the nations that these four kings defeat, Rephaim, Zuzim, Chori, then further on down, reading verse number 7, it mentions Amalek, and it mentions the Emori. And when you think of these kings, Zuzim, Amim, Chori, Rephaim, this list of kings essentially is found in the very beginning of the book of Devarim. These are the great powerful kings of the land of Canaan that were there from way before. And it's interesting that if you remember the book of Devarim begins by telling God, and Moshe instructs Israel that when you come, you're going to possess your land. And when you come into the land, you should not start up with certain peoples. Don't start a war with Edom, Esav. Don't start with Esav. Don't start with Ammon. And don't start with Moab. These nations, you don't start war with them, because God gave them their land. You have your land and they have their land. And if you remember the book of Devarim gives a proof. There's a proof in the book that God gave them their land. How do I know that God gave Edom or Esav his land? So you can't take it away, because that's God's gift to Edom. You have your gift, but Edom has their gift. And the proof in the book of Devarim, in the first chapter, is very interesting. And the same is true of Moab and Ammon. In the case of Edom, for example, because before Edom possessed the land, the Chori were there. And God dispossessed the Chori and gave the land to Edom. In other words, the proof that Edom and Ammon and Moab, it's a God-given land. God gave them their land. Don't try to take it away. The proof is that had God not assisted them, they could never have possessed their land, because the Chori were there before. The Zuzim were there before. The Amim were there before. These are giants. These are there from the very beginning of time, giants. And you can't simply defeat them. It's very difficult to defeat them. So presumably, if Edom dispossesses the Chori, it must have been with God's assistance. And you look at the list of nations that are there in the first chapter of the book of Devarim, and it's virtually identical to the list that we find in chapter 14. The list of peoples who once lived in the land and were dispossessed. Rephaim is a good example. Rephaim means the giants. Rephaim, giants. And in fact, just to pick up this theme a little more, if you remember the book of Devarim, the battle against the first battle that Israel wins against, in order to possess some land on the other side of the Jordan, Canaanite land, are the wars against Sichon and against Og. And it's clear from the Torah that Sichon and Og were told that Og melech HaBashan, ki rak Og nishar miyete harephaim. He is the one remaining giant. In other words, the defeat of Og in the beginning of the book of Devarim is proof positive that this land is a God-given land to you, Israel. Because how can one defeat the giants? Only with God's assistance. So over here, coming back to chapter 14, and there are many other interesting features that I can't get into now, but they're very interesting, including, but I'm not going to get into it now, so please don't ask me about it, but I'm not going to discuss it. But what is curious is verse number 7, that amongst the powerful nations that dwell in the land, they went to Ein Mishpat and subdued the territory of Amalek. This is the first mention of Amalek, which is verse number 7 of chapter 14, which is very interesting given the fact that Amalek is Esav's grandson, who's mentioned next in chapter 36. So what does it mean they subdued the territory of Amalek generations before Amalek actually exists? It's a very obvious question, and it's a very interesting study, but we'll leave that on aside. It's not directly relevant to our topic this evening, but here's the point. The four kings have defeated the powerful nations that once possessed what we call the land of Canaan. Okay, now the 4 kings are not going to bother with the 5 little kings, because the 5 little kings are 5 nobodies. And the people they fight with, the nations they fight with, the Chori, the Zuzim, the Amim, the dreadnoughts, these are the powerful ones. And the 4 kings, which include Babel, it's a clash of the titans. That's how the chapter begins. It starts by saying, let me tell you, my child, about the battle of the 4 kings against the 5. The Torah then proceeds to completely dismiss the battle of 4 against 5, and it starts with the 4 against these powerful nations. And in verse number 8, then we have the king of Sodom and Amorah, the 5 kings, engage the 4 kings in the valley of Siddim. And now the Torah in verse 9 mentions the names of the 4 kings and the 5. They engaged Kedolah Omer and Tidal, Amraphel, and Ariochel El-Asar, 4 kings against those 5. So the Torah has given us, once again, repeats the names of the kings and summarizes by saying 4 kings against the 5. You know, typically when we study this in the past, I ask the class the question, let me ask you a question before you finish the story. Who has the advantage here? Is it the 5 kings or the 4? And invariably, someone, usually more than one person, says, well, of course the 5 have the advantage. I say, why? Well, it's 5 against 4. And that, which of course is a utterly ridiculous statement, but actually it's a statement that the Torah wants you to make. Because of course the 4 kings are the 4 powerful kings of the world. The 5 kings, if you want to call them kings, are 5 zeros. And of course there won't actually be a war. How could there possibly be a battle between the 4 and the 5? And there won't be. But the Torah is going out of its way to, I would say, to make fun of, to mock all these kings, the 4 and the 5. It's as if the Torah is saying, in thinking about kingship, generally speaking, what the kings are about, in one word, is themselves. I'm reminded of a book that has a lot of comedy in it, which we're going to read tomorrow night, called Megillat Esther. And there is, within that book, of course, there's a comedic side to the book, notwithstanding that it's dead serious. But there is a comedic side to the book. And we have the king of the world, king of the universe, one might say, who could be read possibly as an utter idiot. So over here, there is a critique of kingship. This is how the story begins. But as we'll see, it's really not about the 4 kings and the 5. There's nothing to do with the 4 kings and the 5. And again, to repeat the question from last week, why is it that our tradition has chosen this particular story, to draw from this story 3 key terms in the most basic of our prayers? The core prayer of our liturgy, the first blessing of the Amidah, draws upon chapter 14 of the book of Breshit. What is that about? So meanwhile, in verse number 10, we're now told about the great battle between the 5 kings and the 4. And what's clear is there is no battle. The valley of Siddim is dotted with pits, human pits. And of course, the king of Sodom and Amorah fall into them. One might say they fell in battle. It's another part. They fell in battle, literally fell into the slime pits. The rest of them ran away. And the 4 kings, notice they simply take the possessions, vayelechu, and they keep walking. They're walking home. Oh, let's pick up these possessions. They took Lot and his possessions. Vayelechu in verse number 12. They're walking. There's no war. There can't be a war. Oh, well, I see. They're here. Let's take some stuff. Let's keep going home. They're walking north. Fine. And now we have, what interests us is Vayavo HaPalit. A fugitive from the battlefield brings the news to Abraham, who's called Avram. Avram, the Hebrew, the Ivri, the one from the other side. He is secure in his dwelling place. He lives with Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre. These are Abraham's allies, Amorites. And now he's told in this chapter that his nephew Lot has been captured. The 4 kings take all the people and all the possessions. But amongst the people that they took Lot and they took Lot's possessions. So Abraham responds to this. He is Avram HaIvri, the Hebrew, which means the one from the other side. So it's not a war he has to get involved. It has nothing to do with him, actually. The 5 kings instigated war against the 4. There was no battle. And as far as Avram is concerned, it's nothing to do with him. He's an outsider. But his nephew, his kinsman Lot, has been taken. Lot's household has been taken. So Avram then musters his people. Here they're called Chanichav. Chanich in modern Hebrew is like a student. Notice Chanichav, those born in his house, he actually gives the number 318, and he chases after them until done. So Avram chases after these four most powerful kings in the world, and he's in Hebron, and he chases them until Dan, which presumably is north, even though Dan actually in the Torah and in the early prophets is actually in the middle of Israel. The tribe of Dan captures land up north afterwards, but clearly in this story, Dan is up north. And Avram, with his servants, we're told Avadav, he deploys against them. He chases them until a place called Chovah, Mismol Damascus, which is north of Damascus. Okay, let's keep reading. North of Damascus, he retrieves all of the people, and he retrieves all of the possessions. People, the men, the women, the people, the property. And now, after he's come home with all the people and all the possessions, now his motive for entering the war was to save his nephew. That's clear. Kinishba Achiv, his nephew was captured, but in saving his nephew Lot, he saves everybody, including all the people of Sodom that were taken. And now he comes home. And now, in chapter 14, we are told of two responses to Avram's return. The first begins in verse number 17. The king of Sodom comes out to greet Avram. And then we're told he comes out to greet him. And then we're not told what he says. He comes to greet him in the valley of the king. And in verse number 18, we suddenly have a new and mysterious person named Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is the one, his speech to Avram, his words are the words that our rabbinic tradition has taken and has placed them at the center of the first blessing of the Amidah, which is, I would say, to pick out one blessing, that's the most important blessing that we have. This is the blessing, the first blessing of the Amidah, what's known in the tradition as Avot. And here we have it. Vayevarcheyu vayomar. First of all, he's introduced. He's Melchizedek, the king of Shalem. He comes to greet Avram with bread and with wine. V'hu kohen le'el elyon, and he is a priest to God Most High, El Elyon. There we have the term El Elyon. And he blesses Avram, gives him a blessing. Baruch Avram li'el Elyon. Blessed is Avram to the high God, the Most High God. Konei shamayim ba'aretz, creator of heaven and earth. In our Amidah, we have the language of Konei Hakol. In the Friday night services, Konei shamayim ba'aretz, right? After the night, Friday night, right? You have all three right there. Gadol, Gibor, Venora, and you have El Elyon, right? Konei Shemayim Va'aretz, Magen Avot. There you have six terms, one after the next. And the question that we have, of course, is why this particular story? What is it about this story that moved our tradition to choose it, this story, as a central, perhaps the central story upon which they crafted our core prayer? So we have the term El Elyon, we have Konei Shemayim Va'aretz in verse number 19, and verse 20, and he continues to speak, this Melchizedek. And he says, Uvaruch El Elyon, and blessed is the high God. I bless God. Asher migain tzarecha biyadecha, who delivered your enemies into your hands, migain. And in the beginning of chapter 15, God spoke to Avram and said, don't be afraid, Avram. Anochi magain lach, I'm your shield and your protector. But here we have in Melchizedek all three terms. El Elyon, Konei Shemayim Va'aretz, Shem migain tzarecha biyadecha. And the question is, given the approach that we've been taking, namely to look at the biblical story which lies behind the text of the liturgy. What is it about this particular story? So I have several thoughts, but before I get to my thoughts, I'll stop here for a moment. Does anybody have any comments or questions up to this point? Noah, is there anything in the chat?
Not currently. Everyone can feel free to unmute if you would like to share now. Go right ahead.
If they're not, yes, anybody wants to speak up? Now, yes, Debbie?
Do we have any idea what that means, Kel Elyon?
Well,
Just like when it discusses Yitro, does it mean he was a monotheist? I mean, what exactly does that phrase indicate about
very
it?
hard to know. I mean, it is used in our prayer. It's interesting that when Avram responds, because later in the chapter, the king of Sodom says to Avram, let's make a deal. You give me back, you can keep the possessions, give me back the people. And Avram's response in verse number 22, Vayomer Avram el melech Sodom, Harimoti yodiel Hashem el elyon, konei shamayim va'aretz. So Avram repeats two of the three terms. He says, I've raised up my hand, which that means I swear. He takes an oath. I swear, he says, and he adds the word Hashem. He says, Hashem el elyon. The fact that he added Hashem, Yud Hey Vav Hey El Elyon, he's making a statement that as far as I'm concerned, says Abraham, there is a Most High God. And that Most High God is this eternal God, Yud Hey Vav Hey. Now, Melchizedek comes out of, he's certainly not a Jew. There are no Jews. He says Abraham is Jewish, right? They're no Jews, so but he is a priest. He's a holy man, and he's interesting. He's two different things at the same time. He's a Kohen, and he's also a king. It's very interesting. In Melchizedek, now the name Melchizedek appears in one other place in the Bible, which is Psalm 110, which is a very interesting psalm. And the Midrashim try to read the Avram story into Psalm 110. Well, it's not an issue right now. But what is interesting about Melchizedek, my answer is that he seems to believe in a transcendent God or a high God whom he serves. And more than serves, he actually represents. So it turns out that he is and Avram gives him maaser. He gives him a tithe. So Avram respects him.
He recognized
him. And it's interesting that he is this mysterious outsider. We can't speak of him as being a Jew, but we can speak of him as a believer in this El Elyon, which Avram also believes in. Avram gives the El Elyon a name, which is Yud Hey Vav Hey, but it's very interesting that our tradition doesn't seem bothered by the fact that Melchizedek, no, there's the Chumash for that matter. Avram affirms Melchizedek, and he gives him a tithe, which is a gift that one gives, let's say, usually to the Levi, but it can be seen as a kind of priestly gift. So he's a Kohen. He's a Kohen in two senses. He's a Kohen, first of all, who blesses. That's what Kohanim do. There's Birkat Kohanim. And Yitro, as you mentioned, also came with the blessing. So and he blessed Moshe after the war against Mitzrayim. And here Melchizedek blesses Abraham after the war against the four kings. And secondly, he also gives him a tithe. He gives him Maaser Mikol. Avram gives Melchizedek the Maaser. I saw somewhere that someone had written that she thought that Melchizedek gives Avram the Maaser. Vayitain lo Maaser Mikol. I'm sure that's not correct. First, I don't know what that would mean. Maaser Mikol. He comes with lechem and yayin, which is sacramental, by the way. It's another priestly, not with water and bread, but with wine and bread, sacramental. But clearly, it can't possibly mean that Melchizedek gives him a tithe. Cannot be. And that's for another reason, actually, which is very interesting. You know, I just wrote a book about kingship. You have in this chapter, you have a story. This is a chapter about kings. How many kings are there in chapter 14 of the book of Genesis? How many kings are mentioned?
10.
There are 10. There are 4, there are 5, and there's 1. How many of them are good?
One.
One, of course. The default for kings in the Bible, and maybe beyond the Bible, is that they're no damn good. That's clear. We don't do so great with our kings either, by the way. Just read the book of Kings. So, of course, the Torah makes that point, that 10% are good, 90% are no good in different ways. And that's what Avram affirms, of course, in the story. Vayitein lo maaser mikol. He gives him a tenth. Of course, he is the tenth, of course. So the maaser mikol is, he gives him the tithe, 1 out of 10. So Melchizedek is the 1 out of 10. It's just a way the Torah, in a clever way, affirms something about kingship. And the king over here is very interesting, that Melchizedek is a king, but he's also called a priest. He's a Kohen. The word Kohen could be a priest. It also could be one who serves. In fact, David, King David, who's the subject of the book of Shmuel, one of maybe the main subject, he also plays the role of priest on occasion. Now, he's a very complicated character, but from a positive standpoint, he is able to see himself sometimes as God's representative on earth, which is what the king is supposed to be. So Melchizedek is that. Melchizedek is speaking in God's name. Sounds like he's a prophet too. He talks in God's name. And his statement is actually very, very interesting. Let me get to the main point I want to make, and then I'll stop for comments or questions, then I'll get to the secondary point. The main point I want to make is, the question is, why did they choose this speech to be the core statement, which lies behind our Amidah? Requires an understanding of chapter 14. And the point of chapter 14 is this. We talk of chapter 14 as the story of the war of the 4 kings against the 5. That is not actually what chapter 14 is about. That's the backdrop to the story. That's not important. We don't care about the 4 kings or the 5. We care about something else in this chapter, which I hinted at before, which is this, that the 4 kings have defeated the powerful nations that possess the land of Canaan. In particular, striking is that they break down into 2 groups. The last name that's mentioned is Amori, which of course is Canaanite. The Canaani live there, which is the Amori. The other is Zuzim, Rephaim. These are the giants. These are the peoples that possess the land. They're the Canaanites that possess the land, and there are the giants that possess the land. And the 4 kings defeat them. In defeating them, they take symbolic possession. So the 4 kings have symbolically possessed the land of Canaan. When Avram defeats the 4 kings, which is what the chapter is about, Avram's war against the 4 kings, what he has done is he has symbolically possessed the land of Canaan. That's what this chapter is actually about. And by the way, it's actually very interesting that if you remember the story of so-called Meraglim, the scouts or the spies as they called, not really called Meraglim, but Moshe sends them into the land to scout out the land and to bring back a report. And when they come back, they say it's a very good land, but we can't possibly live there. Why can't we live there? And they say, there are 2 different versions of the story, but fundamentally, because the people that dwell there are more powerful than we are. And who actually dwells there? So the Canaanites dwell there. There's Amalek that dwells there. And then they say, in addition to that, the people who live there are giants. They are Rephaim. So you see from that story, actually, it's very interesting. What frightens them is not just Canaan and Amalek. What frightens them is the Rephaim. So the land is possessed by the Rephaim and by the Canaanites. In chapter 14 of Genesis, it's Amori. And of course, the Rephaim, the giants. I would say the Amim, the dreadnoughts, also giants. Zuzim, Amim, that's who dwells there. What Avram has done, in effect, in chapter 14 of Bereshit, this is the way I think the rabbinic tradition understood it. And they understood it this way because it's a simple pshat in the Chumash, as I'll get to in a minute. They weren't making this up. They read the story, in my view, very, very correctly. They understood that chapter 14 is about the symbolic possession of the land. And now the question is, what is the significance of the symbolic possession of the land. Well, I'll ask the question differently. Why do we encounter Melchizedek altogether? Someone speaks in God's name here. This mysterious character who appears and disappears. The right question is, since he seems to be so strange, comes out of nowhere, obviously he's unbelievably important. He speaks in God's name. He blesses in God's name. And what is the blessing that he gives? So the way that the tradition understood it, in my opinion, is this. He has two blessings. The first blessing is Baruch Avram Li'el Elyon Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. Blessed is Avram, to the high God, God Most High. Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. Let's translate. Can they translate creator? It's creator or possessor. Creator of heaven and earth. Now, what does that mean? Why is Abraham blessed to God, creator of heaven and earth? And to understand this verse properly, which is Genesis chapter 14, you have to understand Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. You can't understand this verse without that. And the point is the following. The Torah introduces the God of creation twice in the beginning of the Chumash. The first verse of the Torah is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. That's the first verse. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The God that we encounter in the first verse of the Torah is the creator of heaven and earth. That's chapter 1, verse 1. And that's the first creation narrative. Then you get to chapter 2, verse number 4, which begins with the words, Ela toldot hashamayim v'aretz b'hi baram. B'yom asot Hashem Elohim eretz b'shamayim. So in chapter 2, verse number 4 of Breshit, these are the toldot, story, the generations of heaven and earth at the time that Hashem Elohim, because the name of God in the second creation narrative is Hashem Elohim, created heaven and earth. And the question is, what is the relationship between those two stories? That's a question. That's a real question. And to which I believe, one man's opinion, that the two stories are not conflicting stories, but rather the second story is a continuation of the first. That is to say, the same God who created heaven and earth, who created everything, heaven and earth, is the same God who within the heaven and earth that God created in Genesis chapter 1 continues the process of creation, that same God who creates Shamayim Va'aretz. But in the second story, it's not about the creation of everything. It's about the creation of within that Shamayim Va'aretz, within that everything, is one special place that the Torah calls the Garden of Eden. And in that place, God placed God's beloved creation, that which is created in God's image, which is the human being. And God placed that creation in that special place, that sacred place. And that's a continuation of the first story. One might even say a fulfillment of the first story. And then, of course, there's the banishment from Eden, and the snake and the banishment. And thereupon begins the search for the alternative to Eden. That is to say, the place where the human being and God can interact, can be in contact with each other, where God is present and the human being has the possibility of being present. It's not the Garden of Eden, because we can't be in the Garden of Eden anymore. That's a place for innocence. We're not innocent. But we can still connect to God in a way from where we are. And the search is the search for that alternative space. And the first alternative space in the Chumash is God commands to Abraham saying, Lechucha, go to the place that I will show you. And that place that God has seen, that God has chosen. It's interesting, the word to see, lirot, means to see. It means to perceive. Sometimes it means to choose. In the Mishnah, it means to choose. Roa aniyas divrei admon, says the Mishnah. I see means I accept the position of Admon, the Mishnah to vote. So lirot The land is one that God sees, that God perceives, and God chooses. So Avram is the person who sets out at God's command, the first Lech Lecha, to go to the land that God has chosen. And the place that God chooses is called the land of Canaan. The first place is Shechem. He enters in Shechem, and God appears there. Vayirah Hashem el Avram. God appeared there in chapter 12 and said, I will give you a descendants this land. So Avram goes into the land at God's command. He follows God's command. But chapter 14 is not only about following God's command. What chapter 14 is about is the symbolic possession of the land. At which point out comes Melchizedek and says to Avram, you are blessed to God. What does it mean you are blessed to God? You have fulfilled God's will, God's plan. God's plan was in all creation to set up a particular place where the human and God can intersect, can interact. And you, Avram, have done that. You have enabled God's will to be fulfilled. And therefore, blessed is Avram of God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth. So Melchizedek is saying that the possession of the land of Canaan, which is the alternative to Eden, is a fulfillment of the creator God, creator of heaven and earth, which is how God is described in the first verse of the Torah, and also how God is described in chapter 2, verse number 4, the introductory verse to the Garden of Eden. So you are blessed because you have done God's will. That's the first blessing. And the second verse is, and blessed is God who has delivered your enemies into your hand. What is that blessing about? Well, the blessing is, and Avram, you have done God's will, but we understand that without God's assistance, what could you possibly do? Only with God's assistance, right? I want to do God's will. I want to do the right thing. We can't always do the right thing because sometimes in life we're involved in situations where we don't have the ability to do the right thing. To do the right thing, to live a life, a full life, etc., etc. You need a certain amount of freedom and security, and you need a certain amount of basic needs to be met. We need health, right? So you want to live the good life. If someone determines to blow up your house or whatever, or take away your food, or besiege your city so you can't get food to live, or bomb hospitals, how can you do God's work? You can do God's work within the context of helping others, that you can do. But very often things get in the way of your mission. So says Melchizedek, there are two blessings here. The first blessing is, blessed are you, you're doing God's will. You're doing your particular task in this world. You're carrying out your task. So you are blessed. You're blessed to God. I speak for God. God appreciates that. And then, says Melchizedek, and blessed be God who gives you the opportunities to carry out God's will. These are the two blessings of Melchizedek. They're blessings. And what's interesting when you think about it, this, I believe, is what the Amidah is actually about. This is the Amidah. Because the Amidah, you stand before God and say, in effect, I want to do your will. But in order to do your will, I need a little help. Give me insight. Give me health. Give me a mindset that I can see myself not as bogged down in sin. Let me make a living. Let me live in a place which is secure, in which there's justice, the rule of law, equity, and peace. In short, those are the intermediate blessings of the Amidah. It's exactly what we're asking for. But the question is, how do we relate the beginning of the Amidah to the bakashot, to the blessings? And the interpretation which I'm offering now is that fundamentally, we want to do God's will. We stand before God and say, I know I have a task in this world. I want to fulfill it, but I need your help. Because if I'm not, right? It's what Jacob said when he ran away from home, basically. It's along the same lines. If you give me the opportunity, I will come back and I'll build the bayit. No one's ever done it. I'm the only one who can do it. My father couldn't do it. My grandfather couldn't do it. They can only choose one. And I'm going to build this inclusive structure. But you know what? If you protect me, if you forsake me, I'll never make it back. I need clothing to wear. I need food to eat. I got to make a living. I got to survive. Protect me. I need protection, right? God says, I will protect you. I won't abandon you. I will protect you. So Yaakov does come home safely. I mean, it's not easy, but he makes it back home and he begins his project of building the bayit. This, I believe, is what the rabbinic tradition saw in these blessings. And let me add one final point here, not final, but one more point before I stop and take comments and questions. And that is that the rabbinic tradition saw the chapter 14 as incredibly important chapter. And the reason I think what lies behind their thinking is because they tend to be very good readers of the Bible. And what they saw in chapter 14, understood something about chapter 14. This is chapter 14. But the next chapter is chapter 15. But chapter 15 is the promise to Abraham about the covenant, the Brit Ben Habitarim, that your descendants will someday possess the land. And what they noticed about chapter 15 is that the language of the covenant in chapter 15 and the language of the Torah in chapter 14 are actually parallel. There are at least 10 phrases in the covenant of Brit Ben Habitarim which are found in chapter 14. So they understood that what the Torah seems to be saying is, Avram, you have symbolically possessed the land. That's chapter 14. And God blesses you. And now in chapter 15, God turns to Avram and says, let me tell you something. Some of your descendants who walk your path, they will actually possess the land, not just symbolically. The fourth generation shall return to the land. So it's going to be at some point in the future, the fourth generation will in fact possess the land. And that is the fourth generation, the three generations that suffered in Egypt. And the fourth generation begins to possess the land. They're the ones that defeat Sichon and Og. They're the ones that begin to capture the land. So it's for this reason, I think, that our tradition has chosen these three terms, the El Elyon, the Konei Shemayim Va'aretz, and the Migain Tzarecha, Magen Abraham, around which to fashion our most basic prayer. That's the first point I wanted to make. I think there's a broader point over here about an approach, which is, it's nice to talk about how the rabbinic language plays off the biblical language, but that actually imposes upon us the obligation to actually try to understand the story. It's not just picking a word here and there. We're trying to understand the story that they are sending us to, which is chapter 14. We have to understand that story has many pieces to it. But this is I think the primary piece. Now let me stop here and take comments or questions, and then we'll move on to another thought.
Juliet did have a question in the chat before. I don't know if you'd like to ask it for yourself now that you're on screen. I think it's worth pointing out.
Okay. So I've always been curious about what like Salem and what Jerusalem means. So because you referenced Salem, that someone, I think
Right.
someone lived
So
there.
Mount Tzedek Melech Shalem, that's a very important point. The word Shalem in the book of Breshit, Shalem can mean a couple of things. It means whole or means complete. It's probably related to the word Shalom, which is peace. I mean, the idea of peace being a situation where everything has its place, actually. That probably is related. The word Shalem and Shalom, the problem is that I remember when many years ago, one of my kids had bar mitzvah, we were davening in Israel at that, it was 20 some odd years ago, in the leader minyan, interesting minyan, the leader minyan. Some other time I'd like to talk about the leader minyan. The leader is the name of the people. Their name is leader. I remember what he said. Actually, he said, what he said was, I want to give you a blessing. He said to this kid, he said, my blessing is that you find your place in this world, which allows everybody else to find their place. I thought that was a very profound blessing. And I think that's what it's about. In other words, if people actually understand their role, they'll also understand that other people have different roles. And that they're different pieces of ourselves. And somehow, if we come to a good understanding, that eliminates the conflict, because the conflict is everybody feels he's doing my job, he's doing what I should be doing, or whatever, he's trying to undermine me. But the fact is, if we all understood that shleimut, how the pieces work together, okay? That would lead us on a path towards shalom, towards peace. So the fact of the matter is that the word shalem is a very interesting word in the book of Genesis. It appears over here, Melchizedek is the king of Shalem. Maybe it's Jerusalem, some may think so. What's interesting, as I mentioned before, that in chapter 15 in the covenant, we have language which is drawn from chapter 14. And one of the words that's drawn from chapter 14 is the word Shalem. God said to Avram, the fourth generation shall return to the land. Only the fourth generation shall return to the land. Ki lo Shalem avona emori adhena. For the sin of the Amori, until that point, will not be Shalem. I can't dispossess them until their time has come, until their sin is Shalem. And later in the book of Breshit, after Jacob wrestles with the angel and makes his peace with his brother Esau, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem ir Shechem. And Jacob came back Shalem. So the word Shalem is a loaded word in the book of Breshit. It's a covenantal word. And it's not an accident, as you point out, that Melchizedek is Melech Shalem. Of course, the idea of Shlemut, that's a very important concept, but the idea of Shalom certainly is the way we end all of our prayers. The last blessing of the Amidah is Sim Shalom. It's a prayer for peace. It's a prayer for Shlemut. On the last prayer of the week, which is the prayer of Mincha on Shabbat, that's this very beautiful prayer. Menucha shalema shata rotzeba. We want a rest, which is shlema, which is complete, not just resting tired, but menucha shlema. It's the sense of tranquility, because everything's in its place. So yes, so we'll come back to that hopefully in the future. But it is significant to thank you for that comment. That Melchizedek is the king of Shalem. The idea of Shlemut. And it's probably not an accident that in the Bible, in the conquest of the land is conquered already in the book of Judges. That's the story of Devorah. But there's one piece that's still we don't possess, one last piece that we don't possess in the Bible, which is Jerusalem. That King David actually conquers and also buys. He buys the threshing floor for the temple. And that's the last piece. That's the Shlema, that's the completion. So Melchizedek, Melech Shalem, the sense of completion, the sense of fullness, that's very important. And what he's saying to Avram is, in this story that begins in chapter 1 of God's creation of the world, and God's search for a place where God and the human can dwell together, you, Avram, have helped God in this respect. You're the one who has taken symbolic possession, and therefore you are blessed to God. Any other comments here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just about chapters 14 and 15.
Yes.
Since Avraham has not been yet given a message that God is not going to give him the land now, once he has quote unquote, once he has actually defeated the four kings,
right?
We see from the story his interaction with the king of Sodom that he could have taken over the land, in fact, at that point.
Right, he could have taken the king of Sodom's land, I suppose. That's true.
Well, the five kings.
Yeah, but the five kings are five nobodies in the story. Those are
okay,
not...
but he's acquisitional. We know that. So why doesn't he go with that?
I think because he understands, as he says explicitly earlier, he says it in chapter 20, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. He understands. Now that's after the covenant, that is true. But I think from the very beginning he understands, as the Torah emphasizes, Torah emphasizes the point that he is, now I'll tell you something else, since you raised the question, that even within chapter 14, you see pretty clearly that he can't actually possess the land himself, because the Torah makes the point that even though he has symbolically possessed the land, he defeats the four kings who defeat the powerful nations, including the Amori. But Avram himself lives with the Amori. On there, Eshkol Mamre, those are the people that actually protect him. And it sounds like, by the way, and Rashi understands it this way, I do too, but Rashi said it first, that actually when Avram insists later, they have to get their portion. I'm not taking anything. But the people that fought with me on their Eshkol Mamre, Heim Yechu Chelkam, I believe the parallels in the book of Shmuel, in the war against Amalek there, that what he's saying is on their Eshkol Mamre who didn't fight, but they're with me in the fight because that's where I live, because that's my base, of support. So those people are central to me, and therefore they deserve to get whatever comes to us. I'm not taking my portion. I don't want to take from you. But I think in the story itself, you see, he's fighting the Amori, he possesses the Amori, but who's actually protecting him? With whom does he live? Right? It's the Amori. Honor Eshkol Mamre, of the Amori. The Torah is explicit about that. Heim Bali Brit Avram. So for however it comes to him, he apparently, even before the covenant in chapter 15 is explicated, he has a very clear sense that it's something about the future. And the Torah itself has made that point on more than one occasion with the phrase, Haknani v'aprizi az yoshev ba'aretz. So I think he does come to that understanding, which later on he says explicitly. Ger v'toshav anochi imochem. He couldn't be more explicit. I'm a stranger and sojourner. The covenant's all about the future. Right now, I'm setting up shop here. I'm going to the place that God has directed me. God sent him. I'm doing God's bidding. And yes, it has significance for the future, but it doesn't take place now. Anybody else? There are two other questions or comments? Yes. Noah? Says there are two other people, it says on my screen.
I don't see.
Two people raised their hand, it said. Okay. Anybody else?
I just had one thing related to before. The only other time I can remember that it said Kohen is also Kohen On from Potiphar, or the one that Yosef marries.
Yeah.
But he doesn't seem to follow the pattern of that. He doesn't give a bracha, or he doesn't give a suggestion or anything. How does that fit in? Yeah.
Yitros Kohen Midian, who seems to makes the attempt to join up with Moshe's values, etc. Kohen On is obviously, On is always a negative word. It's never good. He's the priest of Egypt. Joseph is essentially what Paro is doing. I mean, this is related to the Joseph story, Megillah related to the Megillah. Joseph, I'll tell you what, since you asked the question, and we have only about 7 minutes, and since tomorrow night is Purim, I'll say something about the Megillah, since which is related to your question. It's like, here's a question. So we'll continue. I'll get to next week. Next 2 weeks, we have a slightly different plan. But let me just say something about your question. In the Megillah, I wrote my book on the Megillah, Betzion Ovadia. It's my stuff. So one of the questions in the Megillah, about the Megillah, that's raised by Jewish and non-Jewish, largely non-Jewish interpreters, is, did Mordechai do the right thing? Mordechai doesn't bow down to Haman. And not bowing down to Haman, in effect, he has endangered all the Jewish people. Haman has determined to kill not just Mordechai, but Mordechai's people. And he comes pretty close to doing it, I would add. And the question that's raised is, did he do the right thing in not bowing down? So I'm not going to get through the whole discussion about this. I'll give you my point of view for whatever it's worth. And my point of view is very simple. Yes, he did the right. You can't bow down to Amalek. That's his red line. Haman is Amalek. It's God's enemy. You don't bow down to Amalek. So from that perspective, he did the right thing. But, and here's the but when you read the Megillah carefully or properly, you realize that the instruction, the mitzvah, as it's called, mitzvat hamelech, to bow down to Haman, is only for those people in the gate of the king. So the command was only given to people inside the gate. If you're not inside the gate, if you're living in the city of Shushan elsewhere, you don't have to bow down. Only those in the gate have to bow down, and for the simple reason that the story prior to the command is that two people who are the gatekeepers, Bigtan and Teresh, Shomrei Hasaf, they're the gatekeepers. They're the one that conspire against the king. So therefore, the king's command is, it's a loyalty test. All those loyal to me bow down to Haman. King doesn't care about Haman. Well, that's his test. You bow down to the guy that I appoint who happens to be Haman. Now, Mordechai, when we first meet Mordechai in the Megillah, we'll read it tomorrow night. Ish Yehudi Hayah b'Shushan HaBirah. He's living in Shushan. He lives on Delancey Street, not in Gracie Mansion. He's on Delancey Street. We only discover him in Gracie Mansion, in the mayor's province, once Esther becomes the queen. And suddenly, by Mordechai Yoshe B'Shar Amalek. How did he get there? How did he get there? Suddenly he's next to the queen. So he's moving up in the world. And we know he comes from royalty. So I think it's fair to say that he put himself there. He's not there in the beginning. He puts himself there. And here's the point. When you put yourself there, when you're close to power, you move up, two things happen. On one hand, you have an opportunity to do a lot of good because you're very powerful. But on the other hand, the closer you are to the king, the more obligation one has to adhere to the rules of the king. A perfect example is Yosef. The story of Yosef's refusal to become the Egyptian is the story of Mrs. Potiphar. He says to Mrs. Potiphar, I'm not going to get involved with you. I can't do that. It's not right. Your husband's been good to me and he trusts me. And not only that, it would be a sin against God. For all of those reasons, I must say I refuse to get involved with you. Nothing personal. I can't do it. That's the bottom line for Yosef. It's more complex. That's his bottom line. Vayimayin, Mrs. Potiphar is out. Then a couple of chapters later, chapter 41, he's dragged out of jail, stands before Pharaoh. I heard you interpret dreams. God interprets dreams. Tell me your dream. Okay, he interprets the dream. And then he says, and by the way, you better appoint someone quickly to handle this problem. I told you what to do. Find a smart person, place him over Egypt and right? And he'll help you do what you have to do to deal with the problem. Says Pharaoh, who's smarter than you? You're over my house. Only the throne is above you. And here's your chariot. And here's the new clothing I give you. Chariot's a symbol of Egypt. And here's your new clothing. And here's your new name. You're not Joseph. Forget Joseph. You're not Yossel. Yossel, you're not Yossel. Your name from now on is Chris. He's not Yossel. Different name. Safnas Paneach, it's the name of the Egyptian god, actually. Baal Tzafon. That's your name, Egyptian name. And not only that, I'm going to give you a wife too. And your wife is the daughter of the priest of Egypt. That's who you are. You are now remade, no longer Yossel. Right? You are the Egyptian Safnat Paneach with your chariot and your Egyptian clothing and your Egyptian wife and the priesthood. And now Joseph has two choices. He could say, I'm very flattered by the offer. I think I'm going to refuse the offer. I think a Jew like me, okay, you can refuse the offer. You will spend your days, however many they are, rotting in jail. That's your choice. You can do that. You can rot in jail. Or you can accept my offer. But my offer comes with all these conditions. And one of them is the priest of Egypt. And what's his name? Potiphera. You think that's an accident? He can reject Mrs. Potiphar in one setting. When it comes to Paro, you can't reject, you can reject it, you die in jail. But if you accept the role of second in command in Mitzrayim, it comes with all kinds of strings attached. And that's the story of Mordechai, actually. Mordechai made a choice, actually. His choice was to be in a position of power where you can do a lot of good, but it comes with all kinds of strings attached. And one is you bow down to Haman. Now, Mordechai doesn't bow down to Haman. And not only that, what we study in the Megillah, I would point out that Haman doesn't even know he's not bowing down. He doesn't walk over to Haman's face, I'm not bowing down. Haman has no idea. He just avoids him. But the other people in the court, why do you violate the king's command? We're bowing down. And they went to tell Haman, for he had told them he was a Jew. It's not clear whether he can't bow down because he's a Jew, or whether they told him because he's a Jew. But either way, he's in a position where you have to adhere to a new set of rules because you're inside the gate. So to that degree, yes, Mordechai is the cause of the near destruction of the Jewish people. That's true. Because had he stayed home in Shushan and not gone to the gate, to the Chatzer, to the court of the king, we would have no problem. Okay, that's a very interesting question. But that's the point of it. So the Kohen On, yes. Kohen On, he's a priest, but he's a priest of On. He's an Egyptian priest, and presumably with everything that means. They get along very nicely with Pharaoh. They can keep their land. The priests keep their land in Egypt, unlike in the Torah, where the priest has no land. The priests of Egypt have their land. The rest of the country has no land. The land belongs to Pharaoh. So that's one of the many, many, many lessons we can take from the Megillah. It comes with all kinds of conditions. And on the other hand, you could do a lot of good, given that power. And that's the trade-off that one has, I believe. And one faces, one lives in general, it's true, but it's certainly true when one is living in the land of Achashverosh. Very, very difficult decisions one has to make about, on one hand, you're forced to go along with, you're forced to go along with many things you don't actually like because you're in a particular political place. And the other point is, on the other hand, you can do a lot of good. And I would conclude that actually in the Bible, we have such a dispute between two people. Do you simply say, I'm not getting involved, I'm walking away from the whole thing, so I can live a pure life? Or do you say, listen, I work for a wicked king, but having done so, I've saved a lot of people. And that's the dispute we have in the book of Kings between Eliyahu Hanavi on one hand and Ovadia on the other. Eliyahu Hanavi has no interest in Ovadia. Because Ovadia works for King Achav. He works for Achav. And for Eliyahu's standpoint, if you work for King Achav, you're tainted. You're no good. Eliyahu works for nobody. He works for God. He's a loner. He's a hermit. He meets Ovadia. He says, listen, he says to Ovadia, tell Achav I want to talk to him. He says, listen, says Ovadia, I'll tell him, but you often disappear. Now I'm going to get killed. And listen, you may not know this. I've saved a lot of people. Do you know how I saved many of the prophets? Eliyahu doesn't seem too impressed with that. He has a different point of view. You don't get involved. Yes, you save prophets. How many compromises have you made along the way? And compromise for Eliyahu is not, he doesn't believe in compromise. He's a very uncompromising, maybe the most uncompromising person we encounter. That's the question. That's the position that many people find themselves. I guess we all do in a certain way. But sometimes it's very clear that people who work for other people, politics, sometimes very bad people. And the idea is he's a bad guy, but I can do a lot of good. So that's the question of the Joseph story, and that's the question of the Megillah, one of the many questions that the Megillah poses. Let me just say that next 2 weeks, we have to finish this. We don't finish next 2 weeks. I want to bring a guest along with me, someone that I've often taught with. It's my friend Nathaniel Berman, who teaches the Zohar. And because I wanted to spend 2 weeks on the Kedusha. And it's really difficult to I can talk about the biblical sources of the Kedusha that I can do. But I thought it might be useful to have someone who has a bit of a different perspective or different approach to the service in general and to Kedusha in particular. So for the next 2 weeks, we'll spend 2 weeks on the Kedusha, and I'll be there as well. But I think we'll let Dr. Berman lead the discussion. And then we'll return to finish up this business of the triad of Elyon, Magen, Avraham, and Konei Shemayim Va'aretz. I wish everybody a happy Purim, and look forward to running with you soon, again and soon. Noah, what do you want to say?
Well, first of all, thank you, as always, Rabbi Silber, for a wonderful class, and for everyone here for participating. Your questions and comments always keep the discussion lively and make things so much more enriching. As usual, we have more and more coming up at Drisha. Next Sunday, Sunday night, we are going to be starting a new class with Miss Ms. Sarah Zager on Jewish perspectives on household labor, which I'm very excited about as part of our work themed series. You can learn about that class and other upcoming classes on our website. The link is in the chat. And of course, we look forward to seeing everyone again very soon and hope that you have a happy, safe, wonderful, just tremendous Purim. Chag Sameach. Be well.